It gives me tremendous pleasure to introduce you to the man who plays William on the breakout show, This Is Us. He is a veteran of film, television, and theater. Please help me welcome Ron Cephas Jones.
Thank you. So my story is a culmination of a few stories, but in 1988, I saw Denzel Washington do Richard III in the Delacorte in the park, and it had a profound effect on me. I didn't realize that a film actor had that type of theater chops. I had studied theater years ago, came back to New York, was living in New York. I had a young daughter. Her mother and I had been separated, but we were parenting together. And we went to see this production, and I turned to her and said, if I get back into acting, and I had done some acting in school maybe 10, 15 years earlier, I said, I would like to be able to do the classics like Denzel. So what happened was I started to hang out in the East Village in New York at a spot called the New York Poets Cafe. And on the weekends, during the day, I would do odd and end jobs. I taught school. I did remodeling for apartments. But on the weekends, I would hang out down at this place called the New York Poets Cafe. And they would have poetry readings there Friday and Saturday nights. Then they would do a play. Then they would have jazz. Then they would have an open mic. It was probably one of the most creative places that I had ever been. And at the time, it was very hot. The spoken word was coming back, and it was becoming very popular around the country, poetry slams, if you will. So I remember in my journal, I used to write poems, and so I decided I would get up on the open mic and do some poems. Caught reading a couple of poems in the open mic, and a friend of mine came up and said, listen, I'm actually writing a play about this jazz musician. I'd like you to read for me. So long story short, I read the role for him, and we ended up, putting a production together down at the New York Poets Cafe. Just happened so one of the evenings, there was a casting director there, and no one expected anybody from uptown to come that far east, if you know anything about New York and the East Village. It's very rare that you'll find a casting director that far downtown, and a big casting director at that. Her name was Meg Simon, and she was casting a lot of Broadway shows. She happened to be in the audience one night, but I didn't get a chance to meet her. She didn't get a chance to meet me. And about a year later, I got a phone call from her. And she said, I've been looking for you for a year. I saw you a year or so ago down at the New York Poets Cafe doing this play. And I have this role that I would love for you to come in and read for. And I hadn't been on the professional acting track up to that point. I was still reading poems and thinking, I want to get back into acting. I didn't really know how, what foot would I take, how do I define it for myself? So long story short, I went into the audition, I booked the role. It was a regional tour from Syracuse to Cleveland to Seattle, and then the play would come back to New York and have a run. And I thought it was a great opportunity because if I can make it back to New York, then I can maybe get an agent. Long story short, I did the run, came back to New York, and Meg Simon helped me get an agent. And I started booking mainly the stuff that's in New York for television at the time was just Law and Order. That was the thing in New York. It was pretty much the only TV. Basically, most of the actors in New York were heading to LA to do pilot season. You'd come out for a couple of months, meet some people, audition. I didn't want to come to LA because I was a father. I didn't want to leave my daughter. It was bad enough that her mother and I were separated, but we decided to parent together, so that made my responsibilities just as well as if we were living together. Up in the morning, going to school, from everything from diaper changing to homework to teaching how to ride a bike to taking her to the YMCA to swim. So her life was there, and I didn't want to leave it. So hanging out in New York Poets Cafe, met some more people, finally ran into a group of people that were starting this theater company called the Labyrinth Theater Company. I got involved with the Labyrinth Theater Company play reads, and it was a bunch of actors who weren't getting a lot of work, and they were decided, look, we're going to form a company and produce and do our own plays. 2 years into this, I looked across the room, and it was a familiar face. It happened to be this actor, Philip Seymour Hoffman. And I remembered him at the time for one movie he had did called Twister, I believe. It was about a hurricane or a tornado or something like that. But my friend Stephen Adley Giergis, who ended up being a Pulitzer playwriting, award-winning playwright, wrote this play with this role and decided that Phil would direct it. And it was at that point that I met Philip Seymour Hoffman that the trajectory of my career instantly shifted. Because when I met him and we started talking about this role, and it was a very heavy role, what I started to learn was I didn't really know anything about acting. I knew that I had some type of technique. I knew that I could memorize lines. I knew that I could display my feelings. I knew that I could do those things, but what I realized was that I knew nothing about acting, about the process, about the craft of it, about what it takes to assimilate a script, to take apart a script, to put it back together, what actioning is, what your goal is, what your character structure is. I mean, all these elements were brought into my life through working with him and him directing me. We would spend hours in a rehearsal room and just talk about acting. And his career started to move ahead, and what I noticed was he was able to come and do great film work and always come back to New York to direct us all in the plays or be involved in a play. And I said to myself, that's the kind of actor I want to be. And it reminded me of when I first saw Denzel in the park doing Shakespeare, and I realized the totality of what I wanted to do and the type of actor that I wanted to be was going to take some time, and it was going to take a lot of study and hard work. But at that point, I was willing to do it. Now, the difficult part was learning how to define for myself what it means to be successful, not getting confused with fame and fortune. And a lot of times for actors, not being able to pay your rent or not having enough money to pay your bills, your fear immediately is overloaded with the fear of financial failure. So your choices become about what is the work that's going to pay me the most as opposed to what is the work that's going to fill me the most. And so I realized that I wanted to do the work that's going to fill me the most. And so I had to put a different plan together. I had to figure out how to make some money to pay my rent so that I can continue to study in hopes of one day booking great work based on my work. And that's what I started to understand about Phil, and what he gave me is an understanding of be clear about how you define yourself as an actor, and understand that if you want to do great work, you have to study great work. If you want to be a great actor, you have to have the knowledge and carry yourself and do the things that it takes to be a great actor. And that's what I started to do. I even incorporated my daughter into the mold, into the fix. And I started to bring her to rehearsals with me and talk to her about plays and talk to her about reading plays and reading books that lead to plays. And my daughter was totally into it, and we had our relationship shifted, and it created a tighter bond up until today. And my daughter eventually became an actor, and she went on to just star in the original cast of Hamilton. She was one of the actors in the original cast. And she's now, thank you, and she's now 27, but this started when she was about 7, 8 years old. So I guess my point is in the whole idea of the journey, which has led me to This Is Us, was that during that time, I was able to work with some of the best writers and directors, Pulitzer-winning writers and directors, Anna Shapiro, John Patrick Shanley, Philip Seymour Hoffman, names that aren't fame and fortune, but are the most successful people that you could work with in the business of acting. I was afforded the opportunity to work with Sam Mendes in a theater production called The Bridge Project, which was a culmination of actors from New York and America and actors in London coming together to do 2 Shakespeare plays, and it traveled all across Europe. So I was able to travel across Europe learning about Shakespeare. And then an English director approached me about doing Othello in London. And I thought about that. I thought about that day that I saw Denzel do Richard III, rather, in the park, and I was able to do Othello in London. Some years later, I got a chance to work at the Public, and I did 3 Shakespeare plays there, culminating in my having the opportunity to do Richard III at the Public. After, 20-something years of having seen Denzel do it in the park and saying to my daughter's mother, one day I would like to do that. I wasn't quite sure if it was going to be Richard III or whatever, but I knew in my heart that if I wanted to be an actor, it had to be that way. It had to be the way of what we call the way of the samurai. It had to be the way where you go and you learn and you read and you study and you learn how to pull layers so that by the time I walked into the room of This Is Us, I already felt successful. I already felt successful. So the fear was gone. I knew that I could do the work. Now it was just a matter of, do they want a successful actor? Someone that could really do this role in a way that they didn't even realize I could. And Dan Fogelman recognized that. And 2 days later, after I booked the role, one audition from New York, without having to come to LA, without having to do a screen test, without having to do anything else but that one audition in New York on tape. And 2 days later, he sent me an email saying, Ron, there wasn't one false move in that whole audition. And I knew when I saw your tape that you were my guy. So culminating this for all to say is stay true to yourself. It taught me to stay true to myself, to realize that I am the one who defines my success. Thank you.